the previous study, you can grasp that the protection of historic buildings has been expanded from the cultural relics ontology to the historical environment containing non-material elements from the early 19th century to the present. And the concept and the method of protection have been changed accordingly with the development of social economy. This lesson is to learn the history of the international historic building protection development, mainly from the early protection and restoration mode and the protection mode of modern dynamic adaptive reuse. First, let's learn about early protection and restoration. From the last lesson, we learned that in the early 19th century, the theory of building restoration in Europe developed rapidly. Because the objects of protection at that time were important historical relics, the protection pattern of this period was mainly reflected in how to restore the relics. The schools of protection were concentrated in France, Britain, and Italy until the 1960s, and attitudes toward historical and cultural heritage were more favorable to protection and restoration. Let's look at their protection ideas and ways of protecting them. The first is stylistic restoration. France is the country that began to focus on heritage protection earlier. The restoration of style is the beginning of the renovation theory of renovated buildings. A leading figure in the French stylistic restoration, Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, 1814 to 1879, was not only a theorist, educator, but also a practitioner. He led many far-reaching projects, such as Amiens Cathedral, Lens Cathedral, Notre Dame de Paris, and so on. The theory of restoration of this system is mainly for the restoration of Gothic buildings. 4 points of view are included. He believes, first, restoration of cultural relics architecture should pursue artistic perfection and style unity. Second, it is necessary not only to restore the external style, but also to restore the internal structure to a complete state. Third, restoration should be based on scientific research and should be analyzed according to the specific situation and should not adopt the absolute principle. Restorer should stand from the point of view of the original designer to find the best repair scheme for the protection problem and can have some creation. We take the restoration of Notre Dame in Paris as an example to look at the practice of the stylistic restoration. During the French Revolution, Notre Dame suffered the worst damage in history. The cathedral's interior was badly damaged. After Napoleon's coronation as emperor, coupled with the great success of Hugo's novel of the same name, attention was back on the restoration of the building itself. Promoting a massive restoration in the mid-19th century, in 1864, Duke completed the restoration of Notre Dame, creating windows, sculptures, and mirrors based on other medieval French architectural sculptures as copies of their original designs. He even rebuilt the minaret standing at the Latin cross of the church, which was destroyed during the French Revolution. When he restored it, Duke thought the scale of the facade needed to have this high point, and he reconstructed the spire with more than 1,000-century-old oaks. Duke's outstanding restoration 170 years ago was unfortunately destroyed in 2019 by an accidental leak of electricity. That caused a fire. Notre Dame is again facing protection and restoration in the 21st century. The theory of stylistic restoration influenced Europe for more than 2 centuries. It is not difficult to see from the case of Notre Dame restoration that the theory of stylistic restoration provides more freedom for restorers in the process of restoration, and thus leads to a trend of more radical and thorough restoration. After class, you can have a check. Are there any stylistic restoration projects around us? For example, when protecting and repairing the buildings before the entry of the Qing dynasty, did it respect the authenticity or added more of the prosthetics, subjective creation? Stylistic restoration, a single way of thinking on metaphysical restoration, makes the restoration method simple and extreme, and lacks the unified standard of restoration, which makes the authenticity of a large number of historic buildings suffer different degrees of destruction. Anti-restoration campaign, also known as protective repairs. In the middle of the 19th century, the British school, led by John Ruskin and Morris, founders of the British Art Nouveau movement, criticized the stylistic restoration. That is the anti-restoration movement in Britain, also known as protective repairs. For them, it is proposed that protection be used instead of restoration. Ruskin is the initiator of the minimum intervention principle. He discusses his view of anti-restoration through his works, Seven Light Lanterns of Architecture and The Stone of Venice, and advocates the replacement of irresponsible restoration by preservation, protection, and maintenance. In 1877, Morris founded the Ancient Architecture Protection Association. The Declaration on the Establishment of the Cultural Heritage Protection Association defined the view of the anti-restoration theory. First, it is impossible to restore an ancient building. The so-called restoration is to destroy the historical phase of the ancient building and make the ancient building a lifeless fake antique. Too negative. Second, to replace restoration with protection, to protect all historical information on ancient buildings, and to prevent the deterioration with regular maintenance. Too romantic. Third, all measures used for strengthening or covering shall be easily identifiable and shall not alter the body and the decoration of ancient buildings. The advantage of anti-restoration campaign is to pay attention to the historical value of cultural relics. Regard the cultural relics building as a historical reading, but over negative view of all changes in building life and function, over romantic idealization. When the restoration wave of the historic buildings, led by France, and the anti-restoration movement, led by Britain, fought each other, the Italian scholars, represented by Camillo Boito and Gustavo Giovannoni, criticized and reflected on the views of the two schools, and put forward a comprehensive theory of neutral, opposing stylistic restoration as a way of maximizing damage to historic buildings is tantamount to reconstruction. They disapprove of Ruskin and others, arguing that pure preservation will make historical sites ruins, which is not the true protection of historic buildings. The main viewpoints of Italian remediation renewal include the theory of documentary restoration by Boito, the theory of historical restoration by Baltimilla, and the theory of scientific restoration by Giovannoni. Firstly, Historic building is the testimony of cultural and social history. Its value is multidimensional. The protection should focus on all historical information covered by it, not only the purity of its style and integrity of its composition. Secondly, respect the whole life cycle of historical buildings. The original, subsequent changes, and additions or missing parts of historic buildings are important historical materials and should be given equal attention and protection, and ensure that this part of history is clearly defined and legible. Thirdly, we should study historic building objectively and without individuality, and we should not pursue the original style of historical architecture unilaterally, and we should not create the pure style that does not exist. Fourthly, in order to ensure the functionality and integrity of historic buildings, new elements may be added appropriately to the restoration. But new and old elements must be clearly distinguished and ensured that the old elements will not be damaged in the process. The Italian school is based on the French school and British school, observe the two reasonable factors to form the more mature concept of protection and restoration, advocate the neutral material to carry out the minimum degree of intervention repair, and maintain the difference between the old and the new elements. The above is the early concept of protection and restoration. After learning the early protection in repair theory, we will learn how to use dynamic adaptive use. In the first half of the 20th century, modernism was flourishing. They adapted to the conditions of industrialized society, emphasized the globalization of international style and architecture, and ignored the value of the past architecture. Not only did they not emphasize respect for the past traditions and conservation of historic buildings, but also advocated breaking with tradition. After World War II, a large number of historic buildings in the city were gradually decaying because of their lack of protection and maintenance. For the sake of national independence and national identity, all ethnic groups began to maintain and restore different historic sites with national characteristics on the ruins of World War II, forming a climax of cultural relics protection activities. Faced with the large-scale protection practice, people also realized the need to exchange the principles and technical methods of cultural relics protection, and put forward the necessary standard requirements for cultural relics protection. Through a series of important charters and conventions issued by international organizations, the international community paid unprecedented attention to historical and cultural heritage in the 1960s. The International Charter for the Conservation and Restoration of Monuments and Sites, the Venice Charter, was adopted in May 1964 in Venice, Italy. The first international charter for the protection of historic buildings worldwide. At the same time, in 1965, with the assistance of UNESCO, the organization established the International Council on Monuments and Sites, ICOMOS, which became the only international non-governmental organization in the field of conservation and restoration of monuments and sites, and played an active role in the protection of international heritage. It is the continuation and development of the Italian school which lays the theoretical foundation for the protection of modern cultural heritage. The Charter first defined the concept of historic cultural relics. The concept of historical monuments includes not only individual buildings, but also urban or rural environments that witness a civilization, a meaningful development, or a historical event. It also states that this concept applies not only to great works of art, but also to works of less importance in the past that have acquired cultural significance as a result of the passage of time. The Charter clearly states that using cultural relics for the public good is beneficial to its protection within a certain limit. It is also an effective way to protect historical buildings, to carry out the reuse of historical buildings with conditions. Sculptor moved away from the traditional concept of conservation restoration and turned his attention to new elements, which focused more on renewal than protection. In his transformation, modern use and history and art are perfectly integrated, not only solving the function of use, but also embodying the value of history, humanity, and crafts. We can see from the reusing projects of historic buildings, such as the Museum of the Ancient Fort Verona, that sculptor embedded modern aesthetics and deconstructive glass, copper, and concrete elements into the old body, and the historical reality and readability of historic buildings are studied with modern materials, forms, and aesthetic concepts. Sculptor's design concept and technique have had a profound impact on the practice of the adaptive reuse of historic buildings. In the 1970s and 1980s of the 20th century, under the background of globalization trend becoming more and more obvious, ecological environment becoming increasingly unbalanced, and cities' many renewable resources frequently being urgent, people's understanding and ideas of the past, tradition, and history have changed greatly, and a series of theoretical research, conservation movement, and adaptive reuse works have been published continuously. The Nairobi recommendations, adopted at the UNESCO International Conference on the Environment in Nairobi, began to explore the relationship between the two. Based on the Venice Charter, it proposed the establishment of an interdisciplinary team to develop protection issues, while advocating for the inclusion of the surrounding environment in the scope of protection, and stated that conservation and restoration should go hand in hand with revitalization activities. E-commerce, the Baylor Charter, adopted by the Australian National Committee of the International Council on Monuments and Sites in 1979, states that protective use is reasonable and desirable for the continuity, adaptation, and restorative use of a site, which may alter important structures but should be minimized. This approach allows historical sites to gain minimal intervention to continue their own cultural information, while rejuvenating and better integrating into the community by implementing new, compatible features. Therefore, from the 1860s of the international cultural heritage protection, the concept of historic building conservation developed from heritage ontology to overall protection, and the concept of conservation changed from passive protection of conservation, preservation, restoration to active reuse, such as recycling, adaptive use, and more attention was paid to the compatibility of historical sites and cities. To this day, This dynamic adaptive use is still the main mode and method of historic building conservation design. In the next few chapters, we will learn the specific protection modes and design methods in detail.